Hello guys! Tonight we're going to embark on a fascinating journey to a time that most of us have never really stopped to think about. A time before cities, before writing, before everything we call civilization. We're going to discover how our ancestors lived when the world was wild, when the night sky was the only entertainment, and when each day was an adventure of survival and discovery. And the most incredible part, they weren't primitive in the way we imagine. They were ingenious, creative, and had a connection with the world that we lost a long time ago. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. What does before civilization mean? When we talk about civilization, we're talking about cities, agriculture, writing, organized government. All of this started about 10,000 years ago, more or less. But modern humans, people like us, have existed for at least 300,000 years. That means we spent 97% of our existence living in a completely different way than we live today. Let that sink in for a second. Everything we consider normal, essential, modern represents only 3% of human history. Imagine a night sky without light pollution, so dark that the Milky Way shines like a river of silvery light crossing the cosmos. There are so many stars that they seem to touch each other, forming a celestial tapestry that tells stories, marks seasons, guides journeys. The silence is profound, broken only by the distant sound of a wolf howling, the soft crackling of a campfire, the wind whispering through ancient trees. The smell is of moist earth, wood smoke, wildlife in its purest state. It was in this world that our ancestors lived. They had no buildings to protect them, no supermarkets to get food, no hospitals to heal wounds. But they had something we've lost, a visceral connection with the planet, an intimate knowledge of natural rhythms, a community where each person was essential for the group's survival. Life before civilization wasn't a brutal and meaningless struggle for survival, as many movies and books make us believe. It was a complex existence, rich in knowledge, full of rituals, art, music, stories. Our ancestors weren't inferior versions of us. They were as intelligent, as creative, as human as anyone today. The difference is that they applied that intelligence in ways we can't even imagine anymore. Think about it. They knew exactly which plants healed and which killed. They knew how to read animal behavior, predict changes in weather by observing the sky and winds. They knew how to create sophisticated tools using only stone, wood, and bone. And even more impressive, they knew how to live in harmony with nature without exhausting it, without destroying it, taking only what was necessary and leaving the rest to renew. Would we today, with all our technology, know how to survive a month without electricity, without internet, without stores? Would we be able to identify an edible plant from a poisonous one, make fire without matches, find drinkable water in nature? The answer for most of us is no. And that says a lot about what we gained and what we lost along the way. Before agriculture fixed people in one place, humans were nomadic. That means they moved according to the seasons, following herds of animals, looking for areas where fruits and plants were ripe, migrating to milder climates when winter came. It was a life of constant movement, but it wasn't chaotic. It was carefully planned, based on knowledge accumulated over generations. Families lived in small groups, usually between 20 and 50 people. Everyone knew each other, everyone had a role. The elders were repositories of knowledge, storytellers who kept the group's memory alive. Adults hunted, gathered, protected. Children learned by observing, playing, imitating. There were no schools, but there was constant education. Every moment was a lesson about the world. And the night? The night was magical. When the sun set and darkness took over, the group gathered around the fire. The temperature dropped, and the dancing flames offered warmth and light. It was at this moment that stories were told, that myths were born, that knowledge was passed on. Imagine the soft sound of the elder's voice narrating an epic hunting story while children watched with wide eyes, absorbing every word. The smell of food roasting on the coals, the feeling of safety provided by the community around, the infinite sky above as a reminder of the universe's immensity. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. But how did these humans get there? How did they develop the skills, tools, knowledge necessary to thrive in such a challenging world? The answer lies in millions of years of slow and steady evolution, in trial and error, in patient observation, in unexpected creativity. Our most ancient ancestors, who lived millions of years ago, already used simple stone tools, but it was about 2 million years ago that something extraordinary happened. They mastered fire. It may seem simple to us today, but controlling fire was one of the most revolutionary inventions in human history. With fire, they could cook food, making it easier to digest and more nutritious. They could warm themselves in cold climates, expanding the territories where they could live. They could protect themselves from predators who feared the flames, and they could extend the day, creating light and warmth when natural darkness took over. But fire brought something even deeper. It created a meeting point, a place where the group gathered, where the community strengthened, where ideas were shared. Around the fire, human culture as we know it was born. It was there that we learned to be truly social, to tell stories, to plan the future, to remember the past. What do you think your life would be like without any modern technology, just you, nature, and a small group of people you trust? Would we value simple things more? The warmth of a campfire, the taste of a meal earned with effort, the safety of being surrounded by people who care? And there's something curious about this period of human history. For tens of thousands of years, life changed very little. Tools were practically the same generation after generation. Life patterns were constant. There wasn't this idea of constant progress, of accelerated innovation that we live today. Life was cyclical, not linear. Seasons returned, animals migrated on the same routes, plants grew in the same places. But then, about 100,000 years ago, something started to change. Modern humans began to leave Africa, spreading across the world. And as they explored new territories, faced new challenges, needed to adapt to new climates, something extraordinary happened. Human creativity exploded. New, more sophisticated tools began to appear. Art began to emerge. Complex rituals developed. It was as if a key had been turned in the human mind, unlocking a potential that had been dormant. And what caused this creative explosion? Well, nobody knows for sure. Maybe it was the complete development of language, allowing more complex communication. Maybe it was the need to innovate to survive in completely new environments. Or maybe it was something more mysterious, a neurological change that happened in our species. Whatever it was, it marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead us here. But before we got to cities and writing, before agriculture and empires, there was this long and fascinating period where humans lived as part of nature, not as its masters. And it's this story that we're going to explore together. A story of ingenuity, of beauty, of deep connection with the world around us. A story that still lives inside us, somewhere deep, waiting to be rediscovered. The awakening of consciousness. The story of the first human tools begins about 3.3 million years ago, long before modern humans existed. In a place that is now Kenya, in East Africa, our distant ancestors picked up stones and deliberately broke them to create sharp edges. It seems simple, but think about what that means. They looked at a stone, imagined a possibility, and transformed reality to meet a need. This is the birth of abstract thought, the first step toward consciousness as we know it. These first tools were crude, just stones with a sharper edge, but they were revolutionary. They allowed cutting meat, breaking bones to access nutritious marrow, processing fibrous plants. Suddenly foods that were previously inaccessible became available, and with better nutrition, especially proteins and fats, the human brain began to grow. It's fascinating to think that making tools helped create the brain that would eventually invent computers, spaceships, and everything else. Imagine the scene. An African plain at dawn when the golden light is still soft and the air is cool. A group of hominids gathers near a stream where stones are abundant. The sound of running water is constant, relaxing. One of them picks up a basalt stone, feels its weight in hand, examines its rough texture. Then, with a precise movement, strikes this stone against a larger one. The sound is dry, sharp, echoing across the tranquil landscape. Fragments fly, and when the dust settles, a new sharp edge has been created. There's something almost ritualistic about it, a dance between intention and execution. But tools were just the beginning. The real watershed moment, the moment that forever separated humans from other animals, was the mastery of fire. Not just using fire found naturally caused by lightning or volcanoes, but controlling it, keeping it alive, transporting it from one place to another, and eventually creating it from scratch. The first evidence of controlled use of fire dates back to about 1 million years ago, perhaps even more, but it was about 400,000 years ago that fire control became common among our ancestors. And everything changed. Fire wasn't just a tool, it was a companion, a protector, a transformer. With fire, night ceased to be a period of vulnerability and fear. The flames kept predators at bay, lions, hyenas, saber-toothed tigers, all these nocturnal hunters feared fire. So for the first time, humans could truly relax when darkness fell. They could gather, talk, laugh without the constant fear of a sudden attack. Imagine the comfort of that. The sun setting on the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink. Gradually, the light disappears and the cold of night begins to settle in. But there's a campfire in the center of the camp. The flames dance, casting elongated shadows, creating a circle of light and warmth in the middle of darkness. The smell of smoke is comforting, familiar. The crackling of embers is like a constant lullaby. And everyone approaches, forming a circle, faces illuminated by the orange glow, eyes reflecting the flames. Do we still feel that primitive attraction to fire? When we light a candle, when we sit near a fireplace, when we make a bonfire on a beach? Is it ancestral memory calling us, reminding us of a time when fire was the difference between life and death, between community and loneliness? Fire also transformed eating. Cooking meat and vegetables not only made them tastier, but also safer and more nutritious. Heat killed parasites and bacteria, made hard foods softer and easier to chew, and broke down complex molecular structures, making nutrients more available for absorption. Some scientists believe it was cooking food that allowed the human gut to shrink, freeing energy that was redirected to brain growth. Literally, fire made us smarter. And there was a deep social dimension to all of this. Cooking takes time. You can't just devour raw food and move on. You need to wait for it to roast, to cook. So people waited together, conversed, shared. The act of eating became a social moment, not just a biological function. And even today, thousands of years later, we still gather around the table for meals. We still see eating together as an act of union and love. Fire control also drastically expanded where humans could live. Before, they were limited to warm climates. But with fire, they could survive in cold regions, could cross snow-covered mountains, explore territories that were previously inaccessible. It was fire that allowed humans to leave Africa and spread throughout the entire world, adapting to environments as diverse as scorching deserts and frozen tundras. But how did they create fire? At first, they probably carried lit embers, keeping them alive constantly, a work of continuous dedication. Losing fire was a catastrophe, so there was always someone responsible for feeding it, protecting it from wind and rain. Imagine the anxiety of crossing a river with precious embers or facing a storm trying to keep the flame alive. Eventually they learned to create fire from scratch. Two main methods, friction and percussion. Friction involved rapidly rotating a piece of dry wood against another until the generated heat created an ember. It was hard work, required patience, technique, persistence. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic, the hiss of wood against wood, faster and faster, until a thin line of smoke began to rise, bringing the characteristic smell of burning wood. Then, with infinite care, this tiny ember was transferred to a nest of dry, flammable material, straw, moss, tree bark, and gently blown until flames appeared. Percussion used specific stones like flint and pyrite. When struck against each other at the right angle, they produced sparks that could ignite flammable material. The sound was metallic, sharp, and the sparks were small, fugitive stars that lasted only a fraction of a second. Capturing them in the right material was an art. Mastering these techniques wasn't instinctive. It required observation, experimentation, learning, and that meant knowledge needed to be transmitted. Elders taught the young, demonstrating, explaining, correcting. It was practical education based on experience accumulated over generations. And whoever mastered fire creation had special status in the group. It was a vital skill, almost magical. What would it be like to live knowing that your survival depends on physical skills and knowledge, not on money or technology? Would that create a different sense of personal and community value? Tools also evolved. From those first crudely broken stones, humans developed increasingly sophisticated techniques. About 1.7 million years ago, the Acheulean hand axe emerged, a symmetrical tool, carefully worked, that remained practically unchanged for over 1 million years. Think about that. 1 million years using basically the same tool. There wasn't this rush for innovation, this planned obsolescence. If it worked, why change? But eventually, about 300,000 years ago, new techniques emerged. Levallois technology allowed preparing a stone so that with a single precise blow, perfectly formed flakes were detached, ready for use. It was efficient, economical, and produced superior quality tools. Blades, scrapers, spear points, each designed for a specific function. And then, about 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Tools became even more diversified and specialized. Bone needles for sewing, harpoons for fishing, spear throwers to increase throwing power. Humans weren't just reacting to the environment, they were actively shaping it, creating ingenious solutions for each challenge. Each of these innovations represented not just a better tool, but a more complex mind. The ability to imagine something that doesn't exist, plan multiple steps to create and teach others to do the same. That's what makes us human. And it all started with a broken stone and a spark of fire. As night advanced in those ancient times and the campfire flames began to diminish, humans wrapped themselves in their hides and prepared to sleep. But it wasn't careless sleep. Someone always stayed awake, keeping the fire alive, watching. The sky above was filled with stars, billions of them, and the Milky Way was a luminous band crossing the firmament. They didn't know that was a galaxy, of course, but they knew it was important. Constellations marked seasons, guided journeys, told stories, and as the night watcher fed the fire with more wood, listening to the nocturnal sounds of forest or savanna, there was a sense of peace, of belonging, of being exactly where they should be. And we today, with all our artificial lights and bright screens, have forgotten what it's like to see the true sky, but they saw it every night. And perhaps that's why they had a different understanding of their place in the universe. Hunter-gatherers. The art of survival. There's a wrong idea about hunter-gatherers that needs to be corrected right away. Many people imagine that life was a desperate struggle, that they were constantly hungry, that each day was a battle for survival. But the reality was quite different. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, which still exist in some parts of the world, reveal something surprising. They worked on average only 3 to 5 hours per day to obtain everything they needed. The rest of the time was dedicated to rest, socialization, art, games, stories. They had, in a way, more free time than most people today. Of course, life had its challenges. There was no guaranteed security, no health systems, no stores open 24 hours. But there was freedom, there was clear purpose, and there was a deep connection with the natural world that most of us have completely lost. The basic survival strategy was surprisingly sophisticated. Contrary to what the name suggests, hunter-gatherers didn't spend most of their time hunting. In fact, about 60 to 80% of the diet came from gathering plants, fruits, roots, nuts, seeds, eggs, insects, honey. Hunting provided important protein, but it was less predictable, riskier, required more energy. So the smart strategy was to rely mainly on gathering, supplemented by hunting when opportunities arose. Imagine a spring morning 50,000 years ago, somewhere in Europe. The sun rises slowly, painting the horizon in pastel tones, soft pink, pale orange, light blue. The air is fresh, carrying the smell of dew on grass, of wildflowers beginning to bloom, of moist and fertile earth. A small group of women and children leaves the camp, carrying baskets woven from plant fibers. They know the territory perfectly, know exactly where to find what in each season. They walk along a trail that isn't marked on the ground, but is engraved in collective memory. The sound of morning birds fills the air, a natural concert of songs and calls. Tree leaves whisper with the gentle breeze. Bare feet feel every texture of the ground, the softness of loose earth, the hardness of smooth stones, the moisture of still wet grass. They arrive at an area where wild blackberry bushes grow. The fruits are perfectly ripe, almost black, shining in the sun like small jewels. The smell is sweet and intense. They pick carefully, eating some while working, the flavor bursting in their mouths, sweet and slightly acidic. Children laugh, their mouths and hands getting stained with dark purple juice. It's work, but it's also pleasure, social moment, education. Further ahead, one of the older women stops near a specific plant. Its leaves are distinctive, and she knows its roots are edible and nutritious. Using a digging stick, a simple but effective tool, she loosens the soil around the plant. The sound is rhythmic, the stick penetrating the earth with each stroke. Soon she pulls a thick root, still covered in dark earth. She cleans it partially and places it in the basket. A plant like this can feed several people, and what do you think about this? Would we today have the patience and knowledge to identify edible plants? Or would we be completely lost in nature? Leave your opinion in the comments when you have some time. The botanical knowledge of these peoples was encyclopedic. They knew how to identify hundreds of plant species, knew their growth cycles, knew which parts were edible and when, which had medicinal properties, which were poisonous. This knowledge was vital and was meticulously transmitted from generation to generation. Children learned by playing, imitating adults, asking questions, hearing stories that embedded important lessons. For example, there were plants that looked safe but were deadly. One mistake could be fatal. So mothers taught daughters not only to identify plants by sight, but also by smell, by texture, by where they grew, by the time of year. It was a complex education system based on constant observation and practical experience, and it wasn't just plants. They knew edible insects, protein-rich larvae that developed in rotten logs, termites that tasted like nuts when roasted, crunchy grasshoppers. They knew where to find wild beehives and how to collect honey without being severely stung, using smoke to calm the bees. Honey was a rare treasure, an explosion of concentrated sweetness in a world where sugar was scarce. Bird eggs were another important source of nutrition. They knew when birds were nesting, where they built nests, and how to collect eggs without destroying the local population, taking only some, leaving others to hatch. It was a form of sustainable management. Although they didn't use that term, it was simply common sense, ensuring that resources continued to be available. As for hunting, it was a more complex activity and generally dominated by men, although women also participated in some cultures. It wasn't simply chasing an animal until catching it. It was strategy, deep knowledge of animal behavior, extreme patience, and often coordinated teamwork. Imagine a group of hunters preparing an expedition. It's late afternoon, and they know there's a herd of deer that usually passes through a certain area at dusk to drink water at a stream. They spent days observing the animals' movement patterns, learning their routes, their schedules, their behaviors. The hunters prepare carefully. They rub aromatic plants on their skin to mask human smell. They check their spears, sharp stone points firmly tied to light but resistant wooden shafts. Some carry spear throwers, ingenious tools that function as arm extensions, allowing them to throw spears with much more force and distance. They move silently through the forest. Each step is calculated, avoiding dry branches that could snap, moving in the wind's direction so their smell doesn't reach the animals. The sun is low now, filtering through leaves in golden rays that illuminate particles of pollen and dust in the air. The world is transitioning between day and night, a magical moment when everything seems suspended. They reach the strategic position, near the stream but hidden behind dense bushes. Now they wait, and waiting requires a form of patience that most people today no longer know. There's no phone to check, no clock to look at. There's only the present moment, slow and controlled breathing, attentive observation of every movement, every sound. The sound of the stream is constant, a soft murmur. Birds sing their last songs before nightfall. A light breeze stirs the leaves. The forest smell is rich, earth, decomposing leaves, pine sap, distant wildflowers. And then movement. A young deer appears at the edge of the clearing, cautious, alert ears catching every sound. Behind it, other herd members slowly emerge from the shadows. The hunters remain completely still. One wrong movement and the animals will flee. They communicate with minimal gestures, glances, signals they've practiced countless times. When the deer start drinking, lowering their heads to the water, it's the moment of vulnerability. One of the hunters rises gently, his spear thrower already positioned. With a fluid, precise movement he throws, the spear cuts through the air with a sharp sound. If the throw is successful, the deer falls quickly. If not, the herd explodes into movement, disappearing into the forest in seconds, and the hunters return empty-handed. Hunting was always a combination of skill and luck. When hunting was successful, there was gratitude. It wasn't seen as dominion over nature, but as participation in a cycle. Many hunter-gatherer cultures had Thanksgiving rituals, apologizing to the animal's spirit, acknowledging the sacrifice. The animal would be completely utilized, nothing wasted. Meat to eat, hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools and needles, tendons for ropes, even internal organs had specific uses. Have we lost that deep respect for the source of our food when it started coming wrapped in plastic, disconnected from its origin? Back at camp, food was shared. There was no concept of individual ownership over food resources. What was obtained was divided. This created a social safety net. Today you were lucky in the hunt, tomorrow it might be someone else. But everyone eats because everyone shares. It was a system that ensured no one went hungry as long as food was available. The meal around the fire was a special moment. Meat was slowly roasted over coals, the delicious smell spreading, making mouths water. Roots were cooked in hot ashes. Fruits and nuts were passed from hand to hand. There was conversation, laughter, stories. Children ran around, playing before sitting down to eat. Elders watched, smiling, their wrinkled hands accepting portions of food offered with respect. After the meal, as night deepened and the sky filled with stars, there was time to relax. Some did manual work, sharpening tools, sewing clothes, weaving baskets. Others simply rested, watching the fire, lost in thought. And always there were stories. The storyteller had a special place, their modulated voice creating images in listeners' minds, teaching lessons, preserving memories, entertaining. Life was cyclical, following the rhythm of seasons. Spring was a time of abundance, with new plants sprouting, young animals being born. Summer brought ripe fruits and long days to gather. Autumn was for preparing, drying meat, storing nuts and grains when possible. Winter was harder, required planning, but also brought a slower pace, more time inside shelters, more time for crafts and stories. And in all these cycles, there was a constant awareness of interdependence with nature. They weren't outside nature looking in. They were part of it, as integrated as the animals and plants around them. And perhaps because of that, there was a peace, a balance, that civilization never really managed to replicate. Prehistoric nightlife. Night in the prehistoric world was something most of us today have never truly experienced. It wasn't just the absence of artificial light. It was the presence of a deep, absolute darkness that enveloped everything. But far from being something terrifying, night was a sacred moment, a period of transformation when the daytime world gave way to something completely different. It was when the community came together most intensely, when the stars told their ancestral stories, and when human imagination took flight. Imagine the exact moment when the sun completely disappears on the horizon. There's a brief instant of twilight, when the sky still maintains a deep blue glow in the west, gradually darkening to indigo and finally to absolute black. The first stars appear timidly, points of pale light that gradually multiply until the entire sky is covered by millions of them. And then majestic, the Milky Way emerges, a luminous band crossing the firmament, so bright it casts faint shadows on the ground. The silence isn't complete, far from it. Night has its own symphony. The hoot of a distant owl calling in the darkness. The prolonged howl of a wolf echoing through the hills, a song of loneliness and belonging at the same time. The rustling of small nocturnal animals in dry leaves, the song of crickets and cicadas creating a constant, almost hypnotic buzz. The wind whispering through trees, each species producing a different sound, pines moaning low, aspens trembling high, and in the center of camp, like a beating heart, the campfire. The flames dance, orange, yellow, with bluish cores where the heat is most intense. The wood crackles, occasionally snapping when pockets of sap explode with small pops. Sparks rise in lazy spirals, climbing in the hot air, glowing briefly before extinguishing like miniature shooting stars. The smoke smells of burning wood, each tree type offering its characteristic aroma. Oak, robust and rich, pine, resinous and penetrating, birch, sweet and smooth. The fire's heat creates a bubble of comfort against the growing cold of night. Sitting in a circle around the flames, group members form a visible community, their faces illuminated by the orange glow, deep shadows accentuating each feature. Eyes reflect the firelight, shining, alive. There's something primordial about this scene, something that resonates deeply in the human soul. Perhaps because it was like this, exactly like this, that our ancestors spent thousands of nights over hundreds of thousands of years. Have you ever sat around a campfire and felt that inexplicable peace? Is it genetic memory calling us, reminding us of when fire was everything? Safety, warmth, light, community. Night was the time for stories. With the day's work complete, with bellies reasonably full, it was time to nourish mind and spirit. The storyteller, usually one of the elders, had a respected and crucial role. There were no books, no writing, all the group's history, all accumulated knowledge, all important lessons were stored in memory and transmitted orally. Stories weren't just entertainment, though they were certainly that too. They were education, they were religion, they were history, they were science, all intertwined in narratives that would stick in the mind. A story about a hunter who ignored signs of weather change and was caught by a storm was a lesson in meteorology and prudence. A story about an ancestral hero who defeated a great bear taught courage and hunting techniques, but also reinforced community values and the importance of honoring animal spirits. The storyteller used their voice as an instrument. Moments of suspense were narrated in low whispers, making everyone lean forward, attentive. Moments of action exploded in volume and speed. Different characters received different voices. There were dramatic pauses, rhythmic repetitions, refrains that everyone knew and could sing along. Hands gestured, creating shadows in the firelight that danced and heightened the drama. Children were enchanted, eyes wide, completely absorbed. But it wasn't just the children. Adults also listened attentively, even to stories they'd heard hundreds of times. Because each teller brought their own style, and because hearing the old stories was comforting, was connecting with continuity, with the past, with the group's identity. And there's something about hearing stories in the dark around the fire that's fundamentally different from any other form of narrative. There are no visual distractions. Imagination is free to create the images, and curiously, each person sees something slightly different in their mind. The sound of the voice, the crackling of fire, the nocturnal sounds of nature around, all merge into an immersive experience. After stories, there was music. Prehistoric musical instruments have been found, some dating back over 40,000 years. Flutes made from bird bones with holes carefully drilled to produce different notes. Drums made from hollow logs or hides stretched over frames. Rattles made from dried gourds with seeds or small stones inside. And of course, the human voice, the first and most versatile instrument of all. Music was simple compared to modern standards, but no less powerful. Repetitive, almost hypnotic rhythms, melodies that rose and fell like the wind, songs that imitated nature, sounds, bird calls, animal roars, the sound of rain, and songs that came from somewhere deep in the human soul, expressing joy, sadness, longing, celebration. Sometimes music led to dance, bodies moving around the fire, feet pounding the ground in sync with drums, creating a tribal sound that echoed in the night. Shadows cast by flames made dancers seem like giants, mythical figures executing ancient rituals. And perhaps they were rituals indeed, dances that asked for good hunting, that celebrated the full moon, that marked important passages, births, deaths, unions. Have we lost something important when music became just something we passively hear through headphones instead of something we create and share together? But night wasn't just for entertainment, it was also for quiet, meditative work. By firelight, with hands busy but mind free to wander, many tasks were performed. Tools were sharpened, the rhythmic sound of stone against stone. Hides were worked, scraped to remove fat and tissue, then stretched and dried. Plant fibers were braided into ropes and nets, clothes were sewn, bone needles passing through tanned leather, tendons serving as thread. There were low conversations while people worked, jokes that generated soft laughter, gossip about who was interested in whom, planning for the next day, deciding where to go, what to look for, discussions about recently observed animal behavior. It was intimacy, it was connection, it was building and maintaining the bonds that kept the group together. And above all, literally, was the night sky. For prehistoric peoples, the stars were infinitely important. They weren't just beautiful, they were practical tools. Constellations marked seasons. When certain stars appeared on the horizon at dusk, they knew it was time to migrate to summer territories. When others emerged, it was a sign that winter was coming. The moon was especially significant. Its 29-day cycle was perhaps the first human calendar. New moon, crescent, full, waning, each phase had its meaning. The full moon illuminated the night with silvery light sufficient to travel, hunt, work. It was celebrated, venerated. Tides for coastal groups were obviously connected to the moon. The female menstrual cycle, mysteriously synchronized with the lunar cycle, created deep associations between the moon, femininity, and fertility. Stars also served for navigation. The North Star, fixed in the sky while all others rotated around it, was a reliable anchor. Constellations created maps in the sky. If you were traveling and knew you needed to go toward a certain constellation, you had a celestial compass. But beyond practical utility, stars inspired wonder, reverence, questioning. What were those lights? Why did they move in predictable patterns? What lay beyond them? These questions, without scientific answers available, gave rise to myths, to stories about gods and heroes immortalized in the sky, to a sense of connection with something greater, mysterious, eternal. Imagine lying on your back in soft grass, still slightly warmed by the day's sun, and looking up. The vastness of the universe extends infinitely. You see the Milky Way, not knowing it's your own galaxy seen from inside, but recognizing its grandeur. Planets shine more brightly than stars, steady light instead of twinkling. Occasionally, a shooting star streaks across the sky, a bright trace lasting only a second, leaving you breathless with its sudden beauty. And then, if lucky, you might see the aurora borealis in northern latitudes. Curtains of light, green, purple, pink, dancing in the sky, undulating like fabric in the wind. It was pure magic, inexplicable, terrifying, and beautiful at the same time. What powerful spirits created such a spectacle? As night advanced, people began to retire to sleep. Shelters varied depending on region and season. They could be natural caves, deep and protected, with the smell of damp stone and earth. They could be temporary structures, branch frames covered with hides and foliage. In warmer climates, they could be simply sheltered areas under rock overhangs or large trees. They slept on soft hides, sometimes stuffed with dry leaves or grass for additional insulation. Families slept close, sharing warmth. The sound of collective breathing, soft and rhythmic, was comforting. Babies occasionally whimpered and were soothed. Someone always kept the fire alive, waking periodically to add wood, keeping predators away and cold under control. Sleep was different from modern sleep. There weren't 8 uninterrupted hours. Studies show that without artificial light, humans naturally sleep in 2 segments, with a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. They called this first sleep and second sleep. Between the two, for an hour or two, people stayed awake in the dark, thinking, sometimes making love, sometimes just existing in a contemplative state. Dreams were taken extremely seriously. It was believed that during sleep, the soul traveled, visited the spirit world, received messages from ancestors or gods. A particularly vivid dream was discussed in the morning, interpreted, its implications considered for group decisions. Prophetic dreams guided hunts, migrations, rituals, and when the first glimmer of light began to paint the eastern horizon, when absolute black gradually gave way to dark grey, then to deep blue, people began to wake. Birds started their morning songs, first a few pioneers, then a growing chorus greeting the new day. The air was at its coldest, crisp and clean. The campfire had diminished to red-hot embers, but still alive, ready to be revived. And so the cycle continued, day after day, night after night, season after season, an existence in harmony with natural rhythms, without hurry, without anxiety about the distant tomorrow. Just the present, the eternal cycle, the community, and the deep connection with the natural world that was, at the same time, home and teacher. But as humans spread across the world, encountering new environments, new challenges, something extraordinary was beginning to flourish. The creative human mind was about to express itself in ways that would leave permanent marks, not just in memory, but on the very rocks and caves. Art was being born, and with it, a new dimension of human experience. Cave art, the first expressions of the soul. 36,000 years ago, in a region that is now southern France, a human being entered a deep cave. They carried a torch, perhaps, or a lamp, made of animal fat burning in a concave stone. The flickering light revealed limestone walls, damp and cold to the touch. The smell was of ancient earth, of minerals, of constant humidity. The sound of footsteps echoed, amplified by the cave's natural acoustics. And then, in that dark place, far from daylight, far from any immediate practical utility, this human did something extraordinary. They took carefully prepared pigments, iron oxides for reds and yellows, charcoal and manganese for blacks, and began to paint. They weren't painting hunting maps, they weren't making orientation markings. They were creating art, art for art's sake, beauty for beauty, expression for expression. And the result, discovered tens of thousands of years later, still leaves us breathless. The Chauvet Cave, named in honor of one of its modern discoverers, contains some of the oldest and most sophisticated cave paintings ever found. Imagine entering this cave today as an archaeologist with a modern flashlight. The first chamber opens before you, and there, on the walls, wild horses gallop in fluid motion. Cave lions, extinct for millennia, lurk with intense eyes. Woolly rhinoceroses, massive and powerful, are portrayed in perfect profiles. Mammoths, with their trunks raised, bears, bison, hyenas, a profusion of wildlife rendered with artistic skill that would be impressive in any era, but is absolutely astounding considering when it was created. The artist, or artists, used surprisingly sophisticated techniques. They didn't just draw outlines, they used shading to create three-dimensional volume. They took advantage of the natural curves of the rock wall to give animals a relief appearance, making them seem to emerge from the stone itself. They used perspective, showing animals at different planes of depth. And even more impressive, they captured movement, horses with multiple legs drawn in slightly different positions to suggest galloping. This wouldn't be rediscovered until high-speed photography thousands of years later. Why did they do this? That's a question that torments and fascinates us. We don't know for sure, of course. We can't ask the artists, but we can speculate, and each theory tells us something about the human mind. Maybe it was sympathetic magic. Painting the animal was somehow gaining power over it, increasing chances of a successful hunt. But if it were just that, why so much beauty? Why such artistic care? A simple sketch would be sufficient for magical purposes, wouldn't it? Maybe it was education. The paintings served to teach the young about different animals, their forms, their behaviors. But again, there's something beyond the purely didactic here. There's emotion, there's soul. Maybe it was religion or spiritualism. Deep caves were liminal places, boundaries between the common world and the spirit world. Descending into darkness was descending into the womb of the earth, meeting animal spirits, communicating with forces beyond common understanding. The paintings were offerings, they were prayers, they were portals, or maybe, and this possibility is the most human of all, it was simply the innate need to create, to express, to leave a mark. The desire to say, I was here. I saw these magnificent creatures. They moved me, and I want you, whoever finds this, to feel what I felt. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. Lascaux Cave, discovered in 1940 by French teenagers, is another Paleolithic treasure. Dating from about 17,000 years ago, more recent than Chauvet, but equally impressive, the famous Hall of Bulls features enormous aurochs, wild ancestors of modern cattle, painted on a monumental scale. Some are over 5 meters long. The sensation of being in this hall, surrounded by these painted giants, must be overwhelming. What's remarkable is the consistency across time and space. Cave art has been found on all continents inhabited by humans, in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, the Americas, in caves, on open-air rock walls, in rock shelters. And although styles vary, there are common themes. Animals, mainly, but also human hands imprinted on walls by blowing pigment around the hand or dipping the hand in pigment and pressing against rock. These handprints are particularly moving. They're so direct, so personal. You can place your own hand over one of these 30,000-year-old prints and realize it fits perfectly. And suddenly the distance of time disappears. Here is a human being like you with a hand the same size who once breathed, thought, felt, loved, and left this simple and profound mark. I was here. Is the impulse to create art, to express beauty, what makes us truly human? Is this where consciousness really flourishes, in the moment when we don't just survive, but create? The pigments used required elaborate preparation. Iron oxides needed to be collected, sometimes from distant locations, then ground into fine powder. Charcoal was burned and pulverized. These powders were then mixed with binders, animal fat, blood, tree sap, saliva, creating a kind of primitive but effective paint. Consistency needed to be right, neither too liquid nor too thick. Tools varied, fingers of course for simple drawings and prints, rudimentary brushes made from animal hairs tied to sticks, bird feathers that could create fine, delicate lines, and blowing techniques where liquid pigment was placed in the mouth or in a hollow tube, like a bird bone, and blown against the wall, creating mists of color or outlines when done around objects like the hand. Imagine the process. You're in the cave, perhaps with some companions. The light from your torch or lamp is dim, wavering, creating dancing shadows. The smell of burning fat mixes with the smell of earth and minerals. The cave's cold penetrates, making you shiver occasionally. You look at the wall, see something in it, perhaps the rock's natural shape suggests the curve of a bison's back. And you begin. First, perhaps a charcoal sketch, basic lines defining the form. Your hands are cold, a bit clumsy, but experienced. You've done this before. Then the pigments, red ochre for the body, applied with broad, confident strokes, black for the mane, for the hooves, for the eyes. You're not copying mechanically. You're interpreting, you're feeling the animal, its strength, its presence. Your companions watch, sometimes comment, sometimes sing softly, creating an almost ritualistic atmosphere. Hours pass, or perhaps days in several sessions. Eventually you step back, the dim light revealing your work. And there it is. The bison lives on the wall. It's not perfect in the photographic sense, but it's powerful, it's true, it's beautiful. And you feel something. Pride, perhaps? satisfaction, a deep connection with the animal and with the very rock that became canvas. And this painting will remain, for thousands of years, protected from rain and wind, preserved by the constant darkness and stable temperature of the cave. Others will come, will see, perhaps add their own marks. The cave will become a sacred place, revisited generation after generation. But prehistoric art wasn't just cave painting. There were sculptures. The famous Venus of Willendorf, a small female figurine from about 25,000 years ago, with exaggerated sexual characteristics, probably related to fertility. There are hundreds of these female figurines found throughout Europe, suggesting a common theme, a shared concern. There were engravings on bone and stone, geometric patterns, parallel lines, hatchings, abstract forms that may have been purely decorative or may have carried symbolic meaning. Some bones have marks that seem to record counts, perhaps lunar phases, perhaps day counts, a precursor to the calendar. There were personal ornaments, necklaces made from perforated animal teeth, shells collected from distant beaches and transformed into jewelry, beads carved from mammoth ivory. Wearing these pieces was a declaration of identity, of status, of belonging. It was showing craftsmanship, trade connections, aesthetic taste. And all this art, all this creativity, flourished while life was still challenging, still required constant work to obtain food and shelter. They didn't wait to have all the world's comforts to begin creating beauty. Beauty creation happened alongside the struggle for survival, not after it. Perhaps because beauty was as necessary for the human soul as food was for the body. What would our life be like if we prioritized the creation of beauty and meaning the same way we prioritize productivity and efficiency? As you mentally exit the cave, returning to daylight, eyes need to adjust. The sun seems intense after the darkness. The colors of the outside world, greens of plants, blues of sky, seem too vibrant. And you carry with you the memory of what you saw, those painted animals frozen in time, still alive on the dark walls. And you wonder what else our ancestors were capable of. What other marvels were they creating, not in deep caves, but in organic objects that degraded and were lost forever? Because what survived, stone and pigment in ideal conditions, is probably only a tiny fraction of what was created. How many wooden sculptures rotted? How many paintings on animal hides disappeared? How many songs, dances, oral poems were lost when the last person who knew them died? The art we have is a narrow window into a much vaster world of creativity. And even through this narrow window, what we see is dazzling. We see humans like us looking at the world and seeing not just resources to be exploited, but beauty to be captured, mystery to be explored, meaning to be created. And in the depths of these ancient caves, lit only by the flickering light of torches, something more was happening beyond image creation. Culture was being created, collective memory, shared identity. The birth of humanity was happening not just as a biological species, but as a spiritual and emotional experience. And that perhaps is the true origin of what we became. Music and ritual. The sounds of the ancestral soul. Long before the first written words, long before the first cities, there was music. Rhythm was there from the beginning, in the beating of the human heart, in the walking of feet on earth, in the constant pulse of life. And humans, with their unique capacity to create and innovate, transformed these natural rhythms into something transcendent. They took the world around them and transformed it into song. The oldest discovery of a musical instrument dates from about 40,000 years ago. It's a flute found in Holy Fels Cave in Germany, made from vulture bone with 5 holes carefully drilled along its length. When archaeologists created replicas and played them, clear and melodic sounds emerged, notes that hadn't been heard for tens of thousands of years, but that suddenly filled the air again, like echoes of a distant but not forgotten past. Imagine the craftsman who created this flute. First, they needed to find the right bone, hollow and strong, of adequate length. Then, using sharp stone tools, drill precise holes, each positioned carefully to produce specific notes. There was no written musical theory, no diagrams. It was transmitted knowledge, it was trial and error, it was trained ear. And when it was finally ready, when the first breath passed through it and created a pure, clear sound, it must have been a moment of pure magic. But why create music? What was the purpose? Music doesn't hunt animals, doesn't build shelters, doesn't warm the body. And yet humans created it, dedicated time and effort to it, valued it deeply. Because music does something that may be even more essential. It feeds the soul, connects communities, expresses the inexpressible, transforms the ordinary into extraordinary. Imagine a clear, cold night. The moon is full, bathing everything in silvery light, so bright you can see sharp shadows on the ground. The group is gathered, not just a few families, but perhaps several, a special meeting that happens only occasionally when different groups cross paths in their seasonal migrations. There's excitement in the air, a different energy. Children run back and forth, animated with new faces. Adults exchange news, update on distant relatives, negotiate, share knowledge about where hunting has been good. And then, as night advances, as the moon rises higher in the sky, instruments appear. Bone flutes, of course, but also drums, hollow logs covered with stretched skin tied with tendons. Rattles made from dried gourds filled with seeds or pebbles. Whistles made from smaller bones. And the human voice, always the voice, the original and most expressive instrument. Someone begins, perhaps one of the elders, beating a slow and steady rhythm on the drum. It's simple, hypnotic, like an amplified heartbeat. Others join, some voices begin to sing, a low melodic hum without specific words, just pure sound. A flute enters, its melody floating over the constant rhythm of drums, rising and falling like a bird's flight. The sound fills the night. It echoes among trees, rises to the starry sky, seems to make the very air vibrate. And something happens in the gathered group. Bodies begin to move, swaying gently in rhythm. Feet pound the ground in sync, hands clap. And gradually, spontaneously, people begin to dance. It's not planned choreography, it's instinctive movement, bodies responding to music in ways that seem to come from somewhere deep and primitive. Spins, jumps, heavy stomps that make the earth echo. Arms raised to the sky, then lowered to earth. Circles formed, people holding hands, spinning together. And the music continues, growing in intensity, drums beating faster, voices rising higher, flutes creating increasingly complex melodies. There's sweat on foreheads despite the cold. There are smiles on faces. There's a sense of union, of being part of something greater than the individual. The group is no longer just separate individuals. It's a collective entity, moving, breathing, existing as one. When was the last time you felt that deep connection through music and shared movement? When was the last time you danced not as performance but as pure expression of joy and belonging? And then gradually the music diminishes. Rhythms slow down, voices soften. Eventually there's only the sound of heavy breathing, soft laughter, the crackling of the campfire. Everyone is tired, but it's a good tired, satisfying. And there's a sense that something important happened, something that can't be completely explained in words, but that everyone feels deeply. Music wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual. And ritual wasn't just empty ceremony. It was the way humans marked important moments, created meaning, connected with forces they perceived as greater than themselves. There were rituals for almost everything. For a child's birth, celebrating new life, asking for spirit protection, welcoming the new community member. The mother, still exhausted but radiant, held the baby while the group sang ancient songs, passing knowledge and blessings through sound. There were rites of passage for adolescence. When a girl had her first menstruation, it was a moment of transformation, becoming woman, gaining the power to create life. Special rituals mark this, sometimes involving temporary isolation, then reintegration with new status. For boys, it could be the first successful hunt, bringing meat to the group, proving capability and courage. There were rituals for death. When someone died, they weren't simply discarded. There was mourning, there was ceremony. The body was positioned carefully, sometimes in fetal position, as if preparing to be reborn in another world. Personal objects were placed alongside tools, ornaments, food offerings for the journey. And there were farewell songs, laments that expressed the pain of loss, but also the hope of reunion in the spirit world. Archaeological evidence shows that Neanderthals, our extinct evolutionary cousins, also buried their dead carefully, sometimes with flowers, suggesting that ritual and reverence for death weren't exclusive to modern humans, but something deeper shared among different species of the genus Homo. There were seasonal rituals. At winter solstice, when days were at their shortest and darkness seemed to dominate, rituals asked for the sun's return, celebrated survival through the hardest part of the year, reaffirmed faith that spring would return. Especially large bonfires were lit, as if helping the weakened sun with earthly fire. At summer solstice, when days were long and nature was in full abundance, there was celebration of gratitude, festivals that lasted entire nights under clear skies. It was a moment of joy, of union, of recognition of blessings received, and there were hunting rituals. Before an important expedition, the group gathered. Stories of past hunts were told, successes and failures, lessons learned. The spirit of the animal to be hunted was honored, respected. It wasn't seen as inferior, but as an equal, a being with its own life and dignity. Asking permission, asking forgiveness, asking for success, all this was part of the ritual. After a successful hunt, there were Thanksgiving rituals. The first piece of meat was often offered back to the earth, to nature, to the spirits. It was recognition that human life depended on the sacrifice of other lives, and this sacrifice shouldn't be taken lightly. Would our modern relationship with the animals we eat be different if we still practiced some form of acknowledgement and gratitude like this? Rituals also involved consciousness-altering substances. Plants with psychoactive properties grew in many regions, and humans discovered their potential very early. Mushrooms, certain roots, wild tobacco, other plants whose modern scientific names don't do justice to their cultural significance. When consumed in ritual contexts, supervised by experienced elders, these substances opened doors in the mind. Visions arose, colored patterns dancing behind closed eyelids, sensations of dissolving into the universe, of communicating with animal or ancestral spirits. It wasn't recreation, it was spirituality, it was seeking knowledge, it was trying to reach beyond the veil of common reality. Shamans, present in many hunter-gatherer cultures, were specialists in these altered states. They traveled between worlds, brought back information, healings, warnings. They entered trance through repetitive music, exhausting dance, prolonged fasting, or careful use of power plants. And when they returned, they told what they saw, and the group listened with deep attention because these journeys were seen as real, as legitimate knowledge obtained from sources beyond ordinary experience. Music was essential in these rituals. Drums beating for hours on end, creating a state of collective trance. Repetitive chants that emptied the mind of everyday thoughts, opening space for something deeper to emerge. Flutes playing melodies that seemed to come from another world, guiding the shaman on their journey. And everyone participated, even those who didn't enter complete trance, because there was something powerful about being present, about adding your voice to the collective chant, your movement to the dance, your energy to the ritual. It was communion in the deepest sense of the word, joining not just with each other, but with the very essence of existence. As the ritual night came to an end, as the moon began to descend and the first glimmer of dawn painted the horizon pale grey, there was a sense of resolution, of completeness. The extraordinary was giving way to the ordinary again, but everyone carried with them something of what they had experienced. A renewed sense of purpose, of connection, of belonging to something greater and older than any individual life. And when the sun finally rose, bathing everything in golden light, when birds began their morning chorus, the group slowly dispersed. Some to sleep, exhausted but satisfied. Others to begin the day's tasks, but moving a bit differently, seeing the world with slightly transformed eyes. Music had done its work. Ritual had fulfilled its purpose. And life continued, enriched, deepened, connected to invisible currents that flowed through time, linking past, present, and a future that was yet to come, full of possibilities no one could completely predict. But one thing was certain. Wherever humans went, whatever they faced, music and ritual would go with them, because they were as fundamental to human experience as breathing. Social structures, the web that binds us. Humans are, by nature, social creatures. We're not the fastest, nor the strongest, nor do we have claws or sharp fangs. Our evolutionary advantage has always been something else, the ability to cooperate on a large scale, to work together, to form cohesive groups where the whole is much greater than the sum of parts. And this ability didn't emerge with civilization. It was there from the beginning, perhaps even predating modern humans, something shared with our most ancient ancestors. A typical hunter-gatherer group varied between 20 and 50 individuals, usually related by blood or close ties. It wasn't too large to lose intimacy, nor too small to be vulnerable. It was the perfect size for everyone to know each other deeply, trust one another, work in harmony. And within this group there was a complex social structure, intertwined relationships that determined who did what, who had authority in which situations, how decisions were made. But here's something interesting. It wasn't a rigid hierarchy like in later empires or even in animal societies like wolves or chimpanzees. It was more fluid, more egalitarian. Of course, there was respect for elders, for their accumulated experience and wisdom. There was recognition of special skills, the best hunter, the best tracker, the shaman, with the strongest spiritual connection, the most captivating storyteller. But there were no kings or queens, no slaves or servants. Everyone contributed, everyone had value. Imagine waking up on a typical morning in this group. The sun is rising, painting the sky with soft tones of pink and gold. The air is fresh, carrying the smell of dew and residual smoke from the night fire. You rise from your bed of hides, stretch muscles that were numb, feel the still cold temperature against your skin. Around you, others are also waking, some already up, reviving the fire, preparing a simple morning meal. There's no chief shouting orders, there are no rigid schedules, but everyone knows what needs to be done. It's shared knowledge, it's mutual understanding, developed over years living together. Some will gather, others will check traps left the previous day, others will work on tools or clothing. And these decisions are made organically with casual conversations, suggestions, consensus. Language was fundamental to all this. And here's one of the greatest mysteries of human evolution. When and how did complex language emerge? We don't have a definitive answer. Language doesn't fossilize, we can't excavate and find ancient words preserved in stone. But we can make inferences. Anatomically, modern humans had everything necessary for complex speech at least 100,000 years ago. The position of the larynx, tongue structure, lung capacity, Everything was there. And more importantly, we had the brains with specialized areas for language processing, something unique to our species. The first words were probably simple, sounds associated with specific objects or actions. Water, fire, run, danger. But rapidly, incredibly fast in evolutionary terms, language became infinitely more complex. We developed grammar, the ability to construct sentences with structure. We developed abstract concepts, words for things that couldn't be touched or seen, like tomorrow, maybe, because. And with complex language came the capacity for sophisticated planning. Not just let's hunt, but if we go to the North Valley tomorrow early morning, and you stay hidden behind the large rocks while we drive the deer in that direction, then we'll have a good chance of success. This entire sentence requires abstract thought, future tense, conditionality, complex coordination. And all this was possible thanks to language. Language also allowed more effective teaching. Instead of just demonstrating, you could explain. See this plant? The leaves have this specific shape and grow in groups of 3. It's poisonous. If it touches skin, it causes terrible itching. But if you boil the roots for a long time, the poison comes out and they become edible. Imagine trying to transmit all this information without words. It would be nearly impossible, and more deeply, language allowed sharing internal experiences. I had a strange dream last night. I'm worried about the coming winter. I miss my brother who died. Emotions, thoughts, fears, hopes, everything could be externalized, shared, and by being shared became less heavy. Empathy, always present at some level, deepened when we could truly understand what the other was feeling through their words. If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Within the group, there were different roles, but all were valued. Hunters, usually but not exclusively men, had the obvious role of bringing protein. It was a position of some prestige, especially for those who were particularly skilled. But prestige didn't necessarily translate to power or special privileges. A good hunter was respected but didn't govern. Gatherers, usually but not exclusively women, provided most of the diet. And their knowledge was vast, identifying hundreds of plant species, knowing when and where to find them, how to prepare them, which were medicinal, which poisonous. It was complex knowledge that took years to master, and it was essential for group survival. Children weren't simply cared for and isolated until they grew up. They were active parts of the group from early on. Small children accompanied mothers in gathering, observing, learning, helping within their capabilities. By 5 or 6, they could already identify common plants. By 10, they were competent gatherers. Boys began practicing hunting with small animals, rodents, birds, perfecting their skills before participating in larger hunts. Elders had a special role. Physically, they might not be the most capable anymore, but their value lay in something else, memory and wisdom. They remembered past droughts and how the group survived. They remembered particularly harsh winters. They remembered where to find water when rivers dried up. They remembered stories from previous generations, lessons learned through sacrifice. They were living libraries in a society without writing. And there's something beautiful about that. In our modern society, the elderly are often marginalized, seen as less productive. But for hunter-gatherers, living to old age was rare and precious. Each elder was a treasure of knowledge that couldn't be replaced. And when one died, it was like a library burning, all that unique knowledge being lost. What would it be like if we valued our elderly the same way, if we actively sought their wisdom instead of setting them aside? Decision-making was generally by consensus. When important questions arose, where to migrate, when, whether to risk a dangerous hunt, the group gathered. Everyone could speak, express opinions, concerns. Elders were listened to with special attention, but didn't have absolute veto power. Discussion continued until consensus emerged, a decision that most could accept even if it wasn't everyone's first choice. This required patience, diplomacy, empathy. It required valuing group cohesion above individual preferences. And it worked because the group was small enough that everyone genuinely cared about each other, was invested in collective well-being. Conflicts happened, of course. Humans are humans. Disagreements, jealousies, angers. But in a small group where everyone depended on each other for survival, letting conflicts escalate was dangerous. So there were mechanisms for resolution. Mediation by respected elders, reconciliation rituals, and as a last resort, if someone consistently caused serious problems, they could be expelled from the group. This was essentially a death sentence, because surviving alone was extremely difficult, so it was a powerful incentive for cooperation. But the group of 20 to 50 people didn't exist in isolation. There was a wider network. Several groups in the same region maintained contact, meeting periodically. These meetings were important for multiple reasons. Exchange of information about regional conditions, where hunting was abundant, where there were dangers. Exchange of goods, stone tools from special rocks found in one region traded for animal hides from another, and crucially, exchange of mating partners. Small groups face the problem of inbreeding. Mating within the same group for many generations leads to genetic problems. So there were systems, probably informal but effective, where young people from different groups met, formed bonds, and sometimes one moved to the other's group. This maintained genetic diversity and also strengthened ties between groups, creating extended family relationships. These larger gatherings were also moments of celebration. Multiple groups together meant more people for rituals, stronger music, more elaborate dances, opportunities to hear stories from other places, learn new techniques, see new styles of art or tools. And there was a shared language that allowed communication. Not exactly a single global language, but within regions, related groups spoke languages similar enough to understand each other, or at least had some individuals who could serve as translators. Group identity was important. Each group had its own identity, its unique stories, perhaps even distinct dialects, particular styles of decoration or clothing. But this identity didn't necessarily translate to hostility toward other groups. There was a broader sense of belonging, of all being part of the same extended human family. Large-scale wars, armies, conquests, these things would come much later, with agriculture and permanent settlements. Hunter-gatherers certainly had occasional conflicts, territorial disputes, revenge for offenses, but not organized warfare as we know it. It didn't make sense. Conquering territory had no value when you were nomadic. Enslaving others was impossible when everyone needed to be mobile. And killing many from a neighboring group only weakened the broader social network on which you also depended. So a form of pragmatic peace prevailed. Not necessarily universal love, but recognition that cooperation was more beneficial than conflict. And within this framework, humans thrived, not through domination, but through connection. As the day advanced and night approached, the group gathered again around the fire. There was conversation about the day, small gossip, jokes, plans for tomorrow. Children played nearby, their high-pitched voices adding life to the environment. And there was a sense of security, not because walls protected them or laws governed them, but because they were surrounded by people they knew, whom they trusted, with whom they shared deep bonds of blood and experience. This social web, invisible but stronger than any physical structure, was the true home. And no matter where they migrated, what challenges they faced, as long as this web remained intact, they would be fine. Because together they were more than the sum of their parts. Together they were humanity in its most essential and powerful form, but the world was changing slowly, imperceptibly. And somewhere, in a fertile corner of the planet, something extraordinary was about to happen. Something that would change everything forever. But before we get there, there's one more fascinating story to tell about what humans built before even planting the first seed. Göbekli Tepe, the temple that rewrote history. In 1994, a Turkish shepherd was leading his sheep through an arid hill in southeastern Turkey when he stumbled upon something strange. Large stones, obviously worked by human hands, emerging from the ground. He didn't know at that moment, but he had just rediscovered one of the most important and mysterious archaeological sites ever found. A place that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the development of human civilization. A place called Göbekli Tepe. When archaeologists began excavating, what they found left them astonished. Massive circles of T-shaped stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, erected vertically and organized in complex patterns. These pillars were decorated with intricate reliefs, sculptures of animals, foxes, lions, serpents, scorpions, vultures, boars. The artistic skill was impressive, but what really shocked them was the dating. Göbekli Tepe was built approximately 11,500 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Why is this so extraordinary? Because 11,500 years ago, humans were supposedly just nomadic hunter-gatherers. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet. Cities didn't exist. Writing was thousands of years in the future. And yet, here was a monumental structure, clearly requiring sophisticated planning, organization of hundreds of people, and coordinated effort over decades, perhaps centuries. Everything we thought about the sequence of human development, from simple to complex, from nomadic to sedentary to monument builder, was being questioned. Imagine that place 11,500 years ago. The landscape was different then. Not today's arid desert, but a greener region with forests of oaks and pistachios, meadows where gazelles and aurochs grazed, streams running through the hills. The climate was changing, the ice age receding, and the world was becoming more hospitable. And in this transitional environment, groups of hunter-gatherers were doing something unprecedented. They came from afar, possibly from tens or even hundreds of kilometers away. How do we know this? Because analyses of the remains found show there was no permanent settlement at the site. Nobody lived there. It was purely a meeting place, a special location visited periodically. And when they came, they brought tools, food, and above all, purpose. The work was immense. Each pillar needed to be extracted from a nearby quarry. Using only stone tools, no metal, they had to chip and shape enormous blocks of limestone. Then somehow move these 10-ton masses to the construction site. Archaeologists still debate exactly how this was done. Wooden sleds, rollers, hundreds of people pulling with ropes. Whatever the method, it required impressive coordination, and then erecting these pillars vertically, digging deep holes, positioning the pillar, perhaps using levers and earth ramps, ensuring it stayed stable, and finally decorating. Artisans spent hours, days, weeks sculpting those animal figures, so detailed you can see muscles, feathers, expressions. Why do all this? That's the great mystery. There's no evidence that Göbekli Tepe served a practical purpose. It wasn't a defensive fortress. It wasn't a food warehouse. There were no dwellings. It was, clearly, a ceremonial site, a temple perhaps, though using that word implies religious concepts that may not apply directly. But something deeply important was happening there, something that was worth the monumental effort. And the most accepted theory is that it was about gathering, ritual, collective identity. At a time when humans were in transition, when the old nomadic way of life was beginning to change, Göbekli Tepe may have been an anchor point, a place where dispersed groups gathered at specific times of the year, performed ceremonies, reaffirmed bonds, shared knowledge, and connected with something greater than themselves. Imagine the scene during one of these gatherings. It's early spring, when the world is being reborn after winter. Groups begin to arrive, coming from different directions, following trails they've used for generations. As they approach the hill where Göbekli Tepe sits, there's anticipation, excitement. This is a special place, a place where the common and the sacred meet. Upon reaching the hilltop, they see the stone circles, massive pillars rising against the sky. Even without a roof, there's a sense of enclosure, of defined space. The sun is setting, painting the pillars orange and gold, shadows lengthening dramatically. The sound of wind whispering through the stones creates a low, constant tone, almost like a chant. People gather. There are hundreds of them now, more than any individual group, more than would normally be seen together. There are voices speaking in slightly different dialects, but mutually comprehensible. There are joyful reunions of people who haven't seen each other for months or years. There are presentations of newborns who came into the world since the last gathering. There's shared mourning for those who departed. And then, as night falls and the sky fills with stars, rituals begin. Bonfires are lit within and around the stone circles, their flames illuminating the animal reliefs, making them seem to move, come alive. Drums begin to beat, a deep and resonant rhythm you feel in your bones as much as hear. Voices rise in song, ancient melodies passed through countless generations. Some people dance among the pillars, their movements choreographed, part of rituals established long ago. Others remain seated, absorbing the atmosphere, entering meditative states. Shamans perhaps consume sacred plants, seeking visions, messages from the spirits represented in the stones, guidance for the year to come. The entire night passes like this. And when the sun rises again, bathing everything in new light, there's a sense of renewal, of purpose reaffirmed. In the following days, there are feasts, exchanges of goods, marriage negotiations, transmission of knowledge. And then gradually, groups disperse, returning to their territories, but carrying with them memories and a strengthened sense of belonging to something greater than their individual group. Was Göbekli Tepe, in a way, the first experiment in civilization? A place where collective identity was built and maintained not through living together permanently, but through regular ritual gatherings? But there's another layer of mystery. After centuries of use, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not abandoned or left to decay naturally. Buried. Thousands of tons of rubble were brought and used to fill the enclosures, covering the pillars, concealing the entire complex. Why? Why go to the immense work of creating this place and then hiding it? One theory is that the very purpose changed. As agriculture began to develop in the region, as groups became more sedentary, perhaps Göbekli Tepe, symbol of the ancient nomadic life, needed to be ritually closed. Perhaps burying it was a way to seal that era, to mark a transition to something new. Or perhaps the burial was, in itself, sacred. Perhaps the idea was that Göbekli Tepe had fulfilled its purpose and now needed to return to the earth, preserved for some future time, or simply completing its cycle. We don't know. And perhaps we'll never know completely. Göbekli Tepe holds its secrets tightly, but what we know is that it fundamentally changes our understanding of human capacity. We didn't need agriculture or cities to create monuments, to organize on a large scale, to produce sophisticated art, to have complex spiritual life. We had all this much earlier, and Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. Since its discovery, other similar sites have been found in the region, though none as old or as elaborate. There's a landscape of temples in what is now southeastern Turkey and northern Syria, a region that, curiously, is very close to where agriculture eventually developed, where wild wheat was first domesticated. This raises a fascinating question. Did religion come before agriculture? Was the need to feed large gatherings at places like Göbekli Tepe one of the incentives to start cultivating plants instead of just collecting them? The traditional narrative says agriculture created free time, which created religion and monuments. But what if it was the opposite? What if religion and ritual created the need that led to agriculture? As you mentally walk among those ancient pillars, placing your hand against the cold stone carved over 11 millennia ago, there's a direct connection with those people. They were like you. They had the same mental capacities, the same emotions, the same desires for meaning and transcendence. And they created something that still impresses us today, something that survived through unimaginable ages, emerging from the earth to tell its silent but powerful story. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that we're part of something much longer and deeper than our individual lives. We're part of a human journey that's been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. And those who came before us, those who raised these stones under skies that knew no light pollution, who danced and sang and sought meaning, they are our ancestors. Their blood runs in our veins. Their dreams echo in our dreams. And perhaps at some deep level they still call to us, inviting us to remember where we came from and who we really are. Knowledge of nature. The forgotten wisdom. There's a romantic but misguided idea that our prehistoric ancestors were ignorant, that they lived in a world of superstition and fear without real understanding of how things worked. But the truth is exactly the opposite. Hunter-gatherers possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of nature that would make most modern people seem illiterate by comparison. They were, each of them, botanists, zoologists, meteorologists, astronomers, pharmacists, and ecologists. Their lives depended on this knowledge, and because of that, it was deep, accurate, and constantly refined through generations of careful observation. Imagine walking through a forest with a hunter-gatherer 20,000 years ago. You see trees, shrubs, plants. Everything looks more or less the same, green, indistinct. But to your companion, each plant is a recognizable individual with name, history, purpose. He stops near a particular plant, its leaves heart-shaped with serrated edges. He gently touches the leaves, smells, then carefully plucks some. This one, he explains, though in words from a language long lost, is good for headaches. You chew the fresh leaves and the pain goes away. But not too many or your stomach will get upset. He knows the right dose, learned from his mother, who learned from hers, knowledge passed through countless generations. Further ahead he points to another plant, this one with bright yellow flowers. That one heals wounds. You crush the flowers, make a paste, put it on cut skin, stops bleeding, prevents infection. And it works. Modern scientists have analyzed many of these traditional plants and discovered they actually contain antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, analgesic compounds. The knowledge wasn't superstition, it was empirical pharmacology developed through thousands of years of trial, error, and careful observation. Willow bark, for example, was used by many ancient cultures to relieve pain and fever. Centuries later, scientists would discover it contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. But hunter-gatherers didn't need to know the chemistry. They knew it worked, and that was enough. Imagine the discovery process. Someone at some distant moment in the past was in pain. Perhaps they experimented with chewing different plants or observed an animal doing something similar, and they noticed that a particular plant helped. They shared this information. Others tested. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Gradually, through countless experiences, knowledge was refined. Which part of the plant to use, leaves or root? At what time of year was it most potent? How much was needed? How to prepare for best effect? It was true science, just without laboratories or published articles. It was the science of survival, where mistakes could be fatal and successes were preserved and transmitted as treasures. And it wasn't just medicinal plants. There was knowledge about edible plants that could fill volumes. Hundreds of species, each with its characteristics. This root is nutritious but needs to be cooked or it's toxic. That fruit is ripe when it changes to this specific color. These leaves are best in spring, become bitter in summer. Those nuts need to be soaked in running water for days to remove tannin before being edible.
How did they know all this? How did they distinguish the 500 plant species in their territory, remember their properties, transmit this knowledge without writing? The answer lies in constant practical education embedded in daily life. Children learned from the time they could walk, observing, asking, experimenting under careful supervision. By age 10, a hunter-gatherer child probably knew more about practical botany than most modern adults will ever know. And there were stories.
Stories that encoded knowledge in memorable ways. Never eat the bright red fruit that grows near running water, or you'll get sick like young Kanu did, and he almost died. Kanu's story, real or not, taught a vital lesson in a way a child would remember forever. Stories were, in fact, a database system, storing critical information in narrative format that was easy to remember and transmit. Curious, isn't it? Have we lost something valuable when we externalized our memory to books and computers? Leave your thoughts in the comments, but knowledge didn't stop at plants. Animals were studied with equal intensity. Each species had behavior patterns that hunters knew intimately. This animal moves in herds of what size? Drinks water at this time of day. During this season, migrates on this route. When threatened, reacts this way. Its tracks look like this, fresh ones look like this, yesterday's look like that. Tracking was a sophisticated art. An experienced hunter could look at tracks and tell not just what animal it was, but how long ago it passed, if it was injured or healthy, if it was running or walking calmly where it was going. They could read the ground like it was a book, each mark telling part of the story. A broken branch here, disturbed leaves there, a tuft of fur caught on a thorn, a drop of blood on a stone. And it wasn't just passive observation, there was a deep understanding of ecology, of how different species interacted, of how environment affected populations. They knew that if there were many rabbits this year, there would be many foxes next year. They knew years of heavy rain meant abundance of certain foods but scarcity of others. They knew controlled burns, deliberately started, promoted growth of certain plants that attracted herbivores, which in turn attracted predators, creating a beneficial cycle. They were active environmental managers, not just passive observers. Astronomy was another area of deep knowledge. The night sky, without any light pollution, was a constant spectacle, and they studied it with devoted attention. Stars weren't just beautiful. They were practical tools and source of profound stories. Imagine lying on an open hill on a summer night, 15,000 years ago. The temperature is perfect, neither hot nor cold. The smell of dry grass and wildflowers fills the air. And above, the sky. Not the diminished sky we see in modern cities with their few visible stars, but the complete, glorious sky as it was meant to be seen. Thousands, millions of points of light, some bright white, others with subtle tones of blue, red, gold. The Milky Way is so bright, it casts pale shadows. You can see structure in it, dark bands of cosmic dust, brighter regions of stellar concentration, and an elder beside you points tracing invisible patterns connecting the stars. See that constellation? When it appears on the horizon at dawn, it's time to migrate to upper valleys. The animals will be there, plants will be sprouting. Another set of stars. When these are highest in the sky at midnight, it's midwinter. The cold will be intense for several more moons. Constellations were calendars, precise seasonal markers, and they were also stories. Each star pattern had an associated narrative, a myth explaining why those stars formed that shape, what lessons they carried. A hunter transformed into stars for his courage. A goddess who fled to the sky. Sacred animals immortalized in the celestial vault. Stories varied between cultures, but the purpose was universal. Give meaning to the heavens, make the cosmos understandable, human, connected. The moon was especially important. Its 29.5-day cycle was probably the first human calendar. New moon, invisible, marking the beginning. Thin crescent appearing in the evening sky. Half moon, growing larger each day. Full moon, glorious, illuminating the night like a silver lantern in the sky. Then diminishing, waning until disappearing again. And the cycle restarted, reliable, eternal. They counted moons to measure time. We'll meet here again in 3 full moons. How the baby will be born in approximately 2 moons. And curiously, they perceived connections, the female menstrual cycle averaging 28-29 days, so close to the lunar cycle. Coincidence? Mystical connection. We don't know what they thought, but they certainly noticed, and this informed their cosmologies, their stories about creation, fertility, life, and death. Tides for coastal groups were obviously linked to the moon. Full and new moons brought higher and lower tides. Quarter moons brought smaller tides. This knowledge was vital for collecting shellfish, fishing, navigating. And again, without telescopes or Newtonian physics, they understood the connection through patient observation. Planets were different from stars. They didn't twinkle. They moved against the fixed stellar background slowly, night after night, tracing complex paths through constellations. They were wandering stars, special, often associated with gods or powerful spirits. Venus, the brightest object in the sky after sun and moon, was particularly significant in many cultures, sometimes seen as morning star, sometimes evening, not initially recognizing they were the same object. Eclipses must have been dramatic events. Imagine never having heard of eclipses, having no scientific explanation, and suddenly in broad daylight the sun begins to be devoured by a dark shadow. Light diminishes, temperature drops, birds stop singing, confused. And then, if it's a total eclipse, darkness in the middle of the day, stars visible, the sun reduced to a ring of fire around a black disk, it must have been terrifying. And it must have generated rituals, attempts to bring the sun back, offerings, prayers. And when the sun returned, as it always did, the ritual's effectiveness was confirmed, reinforcing beliefs. Lunar eclipses were less dramatic, but equally mysterious. The full moon gradually darkening, sometimes taking a strange blood-red tone before returning to normal. Again, rituals, stories, explanations that made sense within their cosmologies, and meteors, shooting stars, streaking across the sky. Brief, bright, unpredictable. Were they signs, spirits traveling between worlds, omens, or simply natural phenomena admired for their sudden beauty? Different cultures probably had different interpretations, but they were certainly noticed and incorporated into the web of meaning surrounding the heavens. Comets, rare visitors with their long tails, must have been generational events. Something so uncommon that stories would be told for decades. When I was young, a star with hair appeared in the sky and stayed there for many nights. And these stories intertwined with terrestrial events, coincidences becoming correlations. The comet appeared, and then came the great drought. Causation or coincidence? Without scientific method, it was hard to distinguish, but patterns were sought, meaning was created. Meteorology was another practical science. Predicting weather could save lives, and they were good at it. They knew how to read clouds, identify formations that preceded storms. They knew certain winds brought rain, others brought clear weather. They knew when air became heavy and humid, storm was coming. When fog appeared in valleys at dawn, the day would be clear. When sunset was particularly red, tomorrow would be good weather. They observed animal behavior as indicators. Birds flying low suggested low atmospheric pressure and imminent rain. Insects particularly active at dusk meant the night would be calm. Animals seeking shelter indicated they sensed something coming that humans hadn't perceived yet. And on longer scales, they recognized seasonal patterns. They knew when to expect first frosts, when monsoon rains would arrive, when spring thaw would make rivers impassable. This knowledge was systematized in mental or simple physical calendars, perhaps marks on bones or stones recording lunar cycles, seasons, important events. All this knowledge, vast and deep, wasn't in books or computers. It was in minds, transmitted orally, demonstrated practically, encoded in stories and rituals. And when an elder died, a library died with them. But as long as tradition remained alive, as long as young people listened and learned, knowledge flowed through generations like a constant river, always the same, but always new. With all our modern technology, do we have more real and practical knowledge about the natural world than our ancestors? Or do we just have different types of knowledge, specialized but narrow, while they had generalized but deep knowledge? As night advances and you continue lying under that ancient sky beside the elder, he continues speaking, his voice soft blending with nocturnal sounds. And you realize you're receiving an education no modern school could offer. An education about how to be truly present in the world, how to observe with total attention, how to see connections, how to live in harmony with larger cycles. And when sleep finally comes, with starlight being the last thing you see, there's a feeling of peace, of belonging, of being at home in the universe. Human migration, the great journey across the planet. About 70,000 years ago, something extraordinary began. A small group of humans, perhaps no more than a few hundred individuals, left East Africa. We don't know exactly why. Perhaps climate changes made their homelands less hospitable, perhaps population pressure or conflicts with other groups, or perhaps simply human curiosity, that irresistible impulse to see what's beyond the next horizon. Whatever the reason, they began to walk. And this walk, extending over thousands of years and countless generations, would eventually lead humanity to every habitable corner of the planet. It was a journey without a map, without a known destination, without any conception of how vast the world was that they were about to discover. Each generation advanced only a few kilometers, perhaps, settling in a new territory for years or decades before some of their descendants continued forward. It was expansion in slow motion, but inexorable, like a rising tide that would eventually cover entire continents. The first routes probably followed along the coast. Imagine walking along the Red Sea beach, tens of thousands of years ago. The sun is rising over calm waters, painting everything pink and gold. The sand is still cool under your bare feet, soft and pleasant. The smell of the sea is strong, salt and algae, marine life. Gentle waves lap the shore with a constant and reassuring rhythm. And ahead, the beach continues, curving along the coastline, disappearing into the hazy distance. Your group is moving, not in a hurry, but with steady purpose. Stopping to collect shellfish in tide pools, their flavors salty and fresh. Fishing in shallow waters with spears, gathering seabird eggs from nests on cliffs. The coast provides abundance, a natural highway of resources that constantly renews. And so you continue, day after day, not knowing you're beginning a journey that your descendants will continue for thousands of years. Modern genetic analyses trace these ancient migrations with surprising precision. Small variations in human DNA function as markers, leaving clues about who came from where, when populations separated, when they reunited. And the picture that emerges is fascinating. All non-African humans alive today descend from that original small group that left Africa about 70,000 years ago. We are, literally, all distant cousins. From Africa, humans first spread across Asia, following the south coast of Arabia, then along southern Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and beyond. And here's something extraordinary. About 65,000 years ago, humans reached Australia. This means they built vessels capable of crossing significant stretches of open ocean. They weren't just simple rafts, but probably relatively sophisticated boats that could carry entire families, provisions, tools. Imagine the courage required. Looking across the water, seeing perhaps a distant landmass on the horizon, or perhaps just observing birds flying in a consistent direction suggesting there's land in that direction, and deciding to risk everything on a journey over the unknown. Waves are large, unpredictable. Storms can arise quickly. There's no rescue if something goes wrong. And yet they went and survived, and Australia was populated, remaining isolated from other human populations for tens of thousands of years, developing unique and fascinating cultures. While some groups headed south and east, others moved north, entering Europe and Central Asia. And here they encountered environments completely different from what their African ancestors knew. Winters, real cold, snow, ice, temperatures that could kill quickly if unprepared. Imagine experiencing snow for the first time. You come from generations that knew only warm or temperate climates, and suddenly white and cold things start falling from the sky. Touching them makes your hands cold and wet. They accumulate on the ground, covering everything in a silent white blanket. The world becomes quiet in a strange way, sounds muffled by snow. Initially, it must have been disconcerting, perhaps terrifying. But humans, adaptable as always, learned. They developed better clothing, sewing hides with bone needles, creating fitted garments that retained heat. They built more robust shelters. They mastered fire even more completely, maintaining it constantly, because losing fire in winter could be fatal. And in these cold environments they found incredible fauna. Woolly mammoths, giants covered in thick brown fur, with long curved tusks. Woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer in enormous herds, and formidable predators, cave lions larger than modern lions, cave bears massive, cave hyenas. Ice Age megafauna was spectacular and dangerous. Hunting mammoths was no simple task. An adult mammoth could weigh 6 tons, had deadly tusks, and was surprisingly fast when provoked. But it provided tons of meat, fat for lamps and high-calorie food, bones for tools and shelter structure, hide for clothing. One mammoth could feed a group for weeks, so the risk was worth it. Hunting probably involved complex coordination, perhaps driving herds toward cliffs or swamps where they became trapped, perhaps focusing on young, old or sick individuals, more vulnerable, using fire to frighten and drive, specially designed spears with sharp stone points, and tremendous patience waiting for the right moment, acting in unison when opportunity presented itself. There's evidence of mammoth kill sites where dozens of animals were processed over years. They weren't indiscriminate massacres, they were occasional events of abundance that allowed groups to stock resources for harder times. What would it be like to live knowing your survival depended on bringing down animals 10 times larger than you, using only stone and wood tools? How much courage, skill, and teamwork did that require? Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, migrations continued. Humans reached the far east of Asia at least 40,000 years ago. And then during the last ice age, when so much of Earth's water was frozen in ice caps that sea level was 100 meters lower than today, a land bridge connected Asia to North America. We call it Beringia, a vast grass plain where today is the Bering Strait, and humans crossed. Exactly when is still debated, perhaps 20,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. But they crossed, and North America, an entire continent untouched by humans, opened before them. Expansion was relatively rapid. In a few thousand years, humans reached the southern tip of South America. Tens of thousands of kilometers traveled, every imaginable type of environment crossed: frozen tundra, temperate forests, scorching deserts, humid tropical jungles, towering mountains, endless plains. Each environment required adaptations. In the tundra, they developed specialized techniques to hunt caribou and musk ox, built snow igloos, used dog sleds. In forests, they hunted deer and moose, fished salmon in rivers, gathered an abundance of plants. In deserts, they found hidden water sources, knew when cacti bore fruit, hunted lizards and snakes. In jungles, they navigated incredibly dense environments, identified hundreds of plant species, some poisonous, others medicinal, others edible. And in all these places they left marks: cave art in the caves of Europe, Australia, the Americas, characteristic tools showing local adaptations, but also lines of cultural continuity. Habitation sites, ancient hearths, meal remains, careful burials. And something else began to happen. Geographic isolation led to differentiation. Groups that had separated thousands of years ago, living in very different environments, began to develop distinct physical characteristics. Adaptations to cold climate, like narrower noses that warmed air before entering lungs. Adaptations to high altitude, like greater lung capacity. Variations in skin color, darker in tropical regions for protection against intense UV radiation, lighter in northern latitudes to allow adequate vitamin D synthesis with less sunlight. But genetically, differences were and are superficial. We're a remarkably homogeneous species. There's more genetic variation within any human population than between different populations. Races, in the strict biological sense, don't exist in humans. We're all variations on the same fundamental theme. And curiously, we weren't always alone. When modern humans arrived in Europe and Western Asia, they encountered other hominids. Neanderthals, a separate species that had evolved in Europe hundreds of thousands of years ago, perfectly adapted to cold climate. They were stocky, muscular, with brains as large or larger than ours. They were skilled hunters, created sophisticated tools, cared for their sick and injured, buried their dead. They were in many ways as human as us. For thousands of years, modern humans and Neanderthals coexisted in the same landscape. Did they compete for the same resources? Did they avoid each other? Or did they interact, perhaps even peacefully sometimes? We know they interbred. Genetic analyses show most people today have about 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. At some point, somewhere, modern humans and Neanderthals formed relationships, had children, and these hybrids survived and thrived. Imagine that encounter: two groups, appearance slightly different, perhaps different but related languages, meeting in a valley, both seeking the same resources. There's initial tension, uncertainty, but also curiosity. Signals are made, peaceful gestures. Perhaps they offer food, perhaps invite to sit around the fire. And gradually, communication happens, understanding emerges, perhaps even attraction, especially among the young, and eventually, mixed families. But around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals began to disappear. Around 30,000 years ago, they were completely gone. Why? Competition with modern humans, climate change, diseases, assimilation through interbreeding, probably a combination of factors. But their legacy remains in our genes, a reminder that human history is more complex and intertwined than we imagined. In other parts of Asia, there were still other hominids. Denisovans, known mainly from bone fragments and teeth found in a cave in Siberia, but whose DNA shows they also interbred with modern humans. Some populations, especially in Southeast Asia and Oceania, carry Denisovan DNA. There was a world of hominid diversity, and we are the only survivors, but carrying genetic echoes of our extinct cousins. As you imagine these vast migrations, these epic journeys across entire continents over thousands of years, there's something deeply moving. Each step was taken by a real person with hopes and fears, joys and sorrows. Each new land reached was seen with admiring eyes. Each challenge overcome was a victory of the human spirit. And cumulatively, these individual journeys, these individual lives, wove a tapestry that covered the world. And eventually humans inhabited almost all habitable land on the planet. From the frozen tundras of the Arctic to the tropical islands of the Pacific. From the driest deserts to the wettest forests. From sea-level plains to the highest mountains, we're the most widely distributed species of any large mammal. And we achieved this not through slow biological adaptation over millions of years, but through rapid cultural adaptation over thousands of years. Our ability to invent, to learn, to transmit knowledge, to cooperate, allowed us to thrive in environments that would have killed our unadapted ancestors. But as these migrations continued, as groups spread and diversified, something was beginning to change fundamentally. In some specific places independently, groups were beginning to experiment with something that would transform everything. Something that would end the era of nomadic hunter-gatherers and inaugurate something completely new. They were beginning to plant seeds. Transition to agriculture. The moment that changed everything. About 12,000 years ago, in a place called the Fertile Crescent, a strip of land that curved from the Persian Gulf through what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Palestine, to Egypt, something began to change. It was a blessed region where rivers flowed generously, where rains were reliable enough, where soil was rich. And growing wild on slopes and valleys, there were grasses with edible seeds, wild wheat, wild barley. They weren't the large productive varieties we know today, but they were nutritious, abundant, and storable. For thousands of years, hunter-gatherer groups had harvested these grasses. Using sickles made of sharp stones mounted on wooden handles, they cut mature stalks, beat seeds to release them, collected in baskets. It was intense seasonal work, a few weeks of concentrated effort during harvest, but it yielded enough grain to feed a group for months, especially when supplemented with hunting and other collected plants. But then, someone at some point noticed something. Seeds dropped on the ground during harvest sprouted the next season. And suddenly, there was an understanding. If you left some seeds intentionally, if you even planted them in a specific place, they would grow there. You didn't need to search for wild fields. You could create your own fields. It seems obvious to us now. But at that moment, it was a revolutionary revelation. It was taking active control over food production instead of simply accepting what nature offered. It was beginning to shape the landscape instead of just inhabiting it. It was, in a way, the birth of a new relationship between humans and nature, one where humans became not just participants, but managers, manipulators, creators. Imagine the first intentionally planted field, its early spring soil still moist from winter rains. A group of people, perhaps an extended family, is working on a gently sloping hillside near a stream. Using fire-hardened digging sticks, they make small holes in the soil. The earth is dark, rich, smells of growth, of potential. In each hole, they drop a few wheat seeds carefully saved from the previous harvest. They cover with earth, press gently, and continue row after row, transforming a piece of wild land into something new, a cultivated field. There's anxiety in this work. They're betting precious resources, these seeds that could have been eaten. They're investing time and effort without guarantee of return. What if it doesn't rain enough? What if animals eat the sprouts? What if the harvest fails? There's no safety net, no alternative supermarket. It's pure risk, but there's also hope. Hope that in a few months, this field will be golden with ripe wheat. Hope for abundance, for food security, for not having to constantly wander, seeking the next resource. And then the wait. Days pass, weeks. The family returns periodically to check, and suddenly, miraculously, green shoots emerge from the soil. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. Seeds are germinating, the experiment is working. There's joy in this moment, a sense of having participated in something profound, of having helped life emerge. As weeks become months, shoots grow, stalks lengthen, leaves expand. There's constant care, removing invasive plants that compete for resources, scaring away birds trying to eat developing seeds, perhaps watering during dry periods, laboriously carrying water from the stream. It's work, more concentrated work than gathering ever was, but there's a difference. It's predictable. You know where food will be. You don't need to search. It's here, in this field you created. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. And then finally, harvest. Stalks have turned golden. Wheat heads are heavy with seeds. It's late summer. Air is warm and dry, perfect for harvest. The whole family is involved. Sickles sing through stalks, the sound rhythmic and satisfying. Piles of cut wheat grow. There's still work to do, separating seeds, removing husks, but there's also a sense of triumph. It worked. They created food, and this harvest is larger, much larger, than they could get collecting wild grains in the same area, because they planted densely, because they cared for plants, because they selected the best seeds to plant. Without knowing, they're beginning a domestication process that, over thousands of years, will transform wild wheat with small seeds into cultivated wheat with large seeds. There, through unintentional but consistent selection, creating new plant varieties. But agriculture wasn't immediate and universal adoption. It was a gradual process, happening independently in various parts of the world over thousands of years. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley. In China, rice and millet. In the Americas, corn, beans and squash. In Africa, sorghum and yams. Each region domesticated plants that grew naturally there, adapting agricultural practices to local conditions. And it wasn't just plants. Animals were also being domesticated. Goats and sheep in the Middle East, pigs in China and Middle East, cattle in multiple regions, and alpacas in the Andes. The process was similar. Capture young animals, raise them in proximity to humans, select the most docile for breeding. Over generations, wild animals became domestic animals, smaller, less aggressive, more dependent on humans, but also providing meat, milk, wool, transportation, labor. And with agriculture and domesticated animals, life changed fundamentally. The biggest change, sedentarization. You couldn't be nomadic anymore when you had fields to care for. You needed to be there in spring to plant, in summer to maintain, in fall to harvest. So groups began building permanent dwellings. First simple wood and mud structures, then, as skills developed, more robust houses. And permanent houses led to villages, the first agglomerations that could be called settlements. This brought advantages, and you could accumulate more possessions without worrying about carrying them. You could build better storage structures, keeping grain dry and protected from pests. You could develop more elaborate crafts, pottery for example, which was too heavy for nomads but valuable for storing and cooking. But it also brought new challenges. Living in the same place permanently meant dealing with waste, with diseases that spread more easily in dense populations. It meant defending territory because now territory had invested value, the fields you planted. It meant potential inequality because productive land wasn't distributed equally, and some could accumulate more than others. And, curiously, archaeological evidence suggests early farmers weren't necessarily healthier than hunter-gatherers. Skeletons show farmers were generally shorter, had more dental diseases due to carbohydrate-rich diet, had marks of heavy repetitive physical work. Diet was less varied, more dependent on a few main crops. If these crops failed due to drought or plague, famine followed. So why make the transition? Perhaps it wasn't deliberate choice. Perhaps it was a gradual process where each individual step seemed reasonable. Plant some seeds to supplement gathering, then more. Then rely on harvest. Then can't go back because population had grown, sustained by agricultural abundance. And there was no more hunter-gatherer way of life for everyone. It was a trap, in a way, but a trap that led to population explosion. Agriculture could sustain far more people per area than hunting-gathering. And numbers have advantages, especially when groups begin competing for resources. Was agriculture progress or just change? We gained food security but lost free time. We gained larger populations but lost equality. We gained civilization but lost intimate connection with nature. There's no simple answer. It was transformation, neither good nor bad, but deeply consequential. And once started, agriculture was irreversible. Populations grew beyond what hunting-gathering could sustain. Knowledge of wild living began to disappear, replaced by agricultural knowledge. And in a few thousand years, the vast majority of humanity lived through agriculture. The era of hunter-gatherers, which had lasted hundreds of thousands of years, was coming to an end. But it didn't disappear completely. Hunter-gatherer groups persisted, and some persist to this day, in regions where agriculture is difficult or where they chose to maintain traditional ways. They are living witnesses to how our ancestors lived for 97% of human history, and studying them, learning from them, gives us a precious window to understand our past, understand fundamental human capacities, understand paths not taken.
As you imagine, that first wheat field, golden under summer sun, gently undulating in the breeze, there's a sense of being on a threshold. Behind, tens of thousands of years of nomadic life, life in close harmony with natural rhythms, life of freedom and uncertainty. Ahead, civilization, cities, empires, writing, technology, all the complexity of the world we inhabit today. And in that field, in that harvest moment, humans were in transition, 1 foot in each world, still remembering forests and hunts, but already dreaming of full granaries and prosperous villages. It was the end of an era and beginning of another. And although much was lost in that transition, ancient knowledge, ways of being, deep connections, something was also gained. The capacity to feed billions, the capacity to build civilizations that reached the stars, the capacity to create art and science and philosophy. It all began with a seed intentionally planted in prepared soil, a small act with vast consequences, echoing through millennia to today. Echoes from the past, whispers of the future. And so we reach the end of this journey, a journey that took us through hundreds of thousands of years, from the first humans breaking stones to create tools, to the first farmers planting seeds that would change the world forever. It was a long trip, but every moment of it connects us directly to who we are today. Think about it for a moment. Everything you are, everything you have, every skill, every thought, every emotion is the result of this long history. Your ancestors survived the Ice Age. They mastered fire. They created art in the depths of dark caves. They sang songs under starry skies, so bright it's hard to even imagine. They migrated across entire continents, crossed oceans, climbed mountains, explored deserts. And with each step, each challenge overcome, they became a little more us. The blood running through your veins ran through the veins of hunters who faced mammoths. Your hands are descendants of hands that shaped the first stone tools, that painted horses on the walls of Lascaux, that planted the first wheat fields. Your brain, with all its incredible capacity to imagine, create, love, is the same brain, fundamentally, that invented music, that built Göbekli Tepe, that looked at the stars and saw not just points of light, but stories, meanings, connections. We are them, not metaphorically, but literally.
and they are us, living through our lives, their hopes and dreams realized in our existence. But what did we learn from them? What do these distant ancestors have to teach us here now in a world so different from theirs? Perhaps the most important lesson is about resilience. Our ancestors faced challenges that would make most of our modern problems seem trivial. They lived in a world without guarantees, without safety nets, without the illusion of control that modern civilization gives us. And yet they didn't just survive, they thrived, they found joy, they created beauty, they loved deeply, they laughed around campfires, they danced under the full moon, they told stories that made them cry and laugh. Life doesn't need to be perfect to be worthwhile. In fact, perfection never existed. In any era, there were always challenges, there were always losses, there were always fears, but there was also always resilience, there was always community, there were always moments of transcendent beauty that made everything worthwhile. Another lesson is about connection. Our ancestors lived in small groups where everyone knew each other intimately. They weren't just relatives or co-workers. They were everything to each other, constant companions, mutual support, community in the deepest sense. And this connection wasn't luxury, it was necessity. Alone, you died. Together, you thrived. Today, in our enormous cities, we can feel more isolated than they ever felt in their vast plains and forests. We have thousands of friends online, but perhaps no person we could really count on in a crisis. We have infinite entertainment, but perhaps no moment of true connection around a fire, no shared story that unites us, no ritual that makes us feel part of something greater. Perhaps we need to rediscover community. We can't go back to groups of 30 people living together permanently, but we can seek deeper, more authentic connections. We can prioritize time with people we love. We can create our own rituals, our own gathering moments around the modern fire, whether it's a dinner table, a bonfire on a beach, or simply a space where we can be vulnerable and true to each other. And there's a lesson about nature. Our ancestors weren't separated from the natural world. They were part of it, as integrated as the animals and plants around them. They knew the rhythms of seasons, the patterns of stars, the behaviors of animals, the properties of plants. And this knowledge wasn't just practical, it was also spiritual. There was reverence, there was gratitude, there was a sense of kinship with all forms of life. We lost much of that. Many of us live in completely artificial environments where temperature is always controlled, where light never varies, where food comes packaged and disconnected from its origin. We don't see the stars. We don't know the names of plants growing near our homes. We don't know what phase the moon is in. And something in us misses this, even if we can't articulate exactly what. Perhaps we can't, and perhaps we shouldn't, completely return to that primitive connection with nature. But we can seek moments, we can spend time outdoors, feel the sun on our skin, the wind in our hair. We can look at the night sky when possible. Remember, we're part of a vast universe. We can learn about the natural world, about creatures we share this planet with, about cycles that sustain life. We can cultivate gratitude for what the earth gives us. What a journey, isn't it? If you enjoyed traveling with us through these ancient stories, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflection, any thought about what you heard, share it in the comments. It's always fascinating to know what resonates with you. And there's a lesson about simplicity. Our ancestors had few possessions. Everything they owned could be carried. But that didn't make them poor. They were rich in time, in experiences, in skills, in stories, in relationships. Their life wasn't defined by accumulating things, but by living fully, by being present, by mastering skills that mattered, by contributing to community, by creating and appreciating beauty. Today, we may have houses full of objects, but how many really bring us joy or meaning? How many are just weight, obligations, distractions? Perhaps there's wisdom in simplifying, in focusing on what really matters. Not necessarily abandoning everything and living in a cave, but questioning. This that I'm accumulating, this that I'm pursuing, does it really enrich my life? Or am I just running on a wheel faster and faster, but not getting anywhere I really want to be. And finally, there's a lesson about impermanence and continuity. Everything changes. Hunter-gatherer life, which lasted hundreds of thousands of years, eventually gave way to agriculture. Agriculture gave way to cities, to empires, to civilizations, and these also changed, rose and fell, transformed into new forms. Nothing remains static. Nothing is permanent. And yet there's continuity. Through all these changes, there's something essentially human that persists. The need to love and be loved. The desire to create and appreciate beauty. The search for meaning. The capacity for wonder. Resilience in the face of adversity. These things were true 100,000 years ago and are true today. And they'll probably be true for our descendants 100,000 years from now if we have descendants, if we can navigate the challenges we face. And we face challenges, no doubt. Climate change, inequality, conflicts, technologies advancing faster than our wisdom to use them well. But our ancestors also faced existential challenges, and they survived not through individual strength, but through cooperation, creativity, adaptability. Those same qualities are still in us. They're our evolutionary heritage, tested and proven over unimaginable ages. So when the world feels heavy, when challenges seem insurmountable, remember, you come from a lineage of survivors. Each of your ancestors, without exception, survived long enough to reproduce. Each faced their own set of difficulties and overcame them. You carry within you the strength, the resilience, the creativity of countless generations. You're not alone. You were never alone. You're part of an unbroken chain, stretching back through time to the dawn of humanity, and stretching forward to a future not yet written. And in that future, what role will you have? What stories will they tell about our era? When someone, thousands of years in the future, looks back at the 21st century, what will they see? Will they see an era that got lost in distractions and conflicts? Or will they see an era that, despite its challenges, found wisdom, that reconnected with essential values, that remembered ancestral lessons and applied them in new ways? This depends on us, each one of us. Each small choice, each moment of kindness, each act of creation, each effort at connection contributes to the larger tapestry. We are the ancestors of the future. Tomorrow's children will look back at us as we look at those who painted horses in caves. What legacy will we leave? But these are questions for the day. Now, in this moment, it's time to rest, to let the mind relax, to allow images of this long journey through time to settle gently, like snow falling in a silent forest. Imagine yourself one last time around that ancestral campfire. The flames dance low now, more embers than fire. The sky above is filled with stars, each one a constant point of light in the dark vastness. The air is cool, but you're warm, wrapped in soft hides. Around you, the soft sound of others breathing as they sleep, a baby murmuring in sleep, an elder snoring gently. There's peace here. Deep peace that comes from being exactly where you should be, from being part of something greater, from trusting the eternal cycle of day and night, seasons and years, life and renewal. Your eyes are heavy. The starlight seems to whisper ancient lullabies, songs your ancestors heard, songs your descendants will hear, and you sleep. Not restless sleep, but deep and restorative sleep, the kind of sleep our ancestors knew, without alarms or worries about the distant tomorrow, just total presence in the moment. Trust in the natural cycle, surrender to the rest your body and mind need. And as you sleep, you dream. You dream of golden plains where bison roam. You dream of ancient forests where each tree is 1,000 years old. You dream of starry skies so clear, the Milky Way seems like a river of light poured across the cosmos. You dream of campfires and laughter, stories and songs, hands holding hands across countless generations. And in this dream, there's a truth. You are part of all this. Not visitor, but participant. Not observer, but heir and guardian. The story hasn't ended. It's still being written. And you wonderful, you resilient, you creative one, you are one of its authors. But now, rest. Let the day's worries dissolve like morning mist in the sun. Let tension flow out of your body, muscle by muscle, breath by breath. You are safe. You are home. You are connected to something ancient and true and enduring. And as night deepens and silence becomes more complete, there's only this: the gentle rhythm of your breathing, the steady beat of your heart, and the feeling of peace, of belonging, of being wrapped in the gentle embrace of time, part of a story that began in the savannas of Africa and continues here, now, in you. Good night. May your dreams be peaceful. May your sleep be deep. And may you wake tomorrow carrying with you something of these stories, a spark of ancient wisdom, a reminder of who you are, where you come from, and the infinite potential you carry within. Rest well, time traveler. You made a long journey today, through ages and continents. And tomorrow, always tomorrow, there will be new journeys, new discoveries, new stories. But now is time for peace. Sleep well.